Hello, and welcome back to the Long Distance Love Bombs podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jeremy Goldberg, and today's guest is the first of several to come that are taking a little bit of a detour from the personal development space and heading into the wild world of the parenting space. If you are unaware, I have a new addition to the family arriving in the next, well, any day now. My partner is about 37 and a half weeks pregnant. And so I've reached out to a bunch of experts in parenting to selfishly give me a little bit of reassurance and comfort as I prepare to navigate this transition and initiation. And Dr. Emma Svanberg is the first of those guests. She is an award-winning clinical psychologist who specializes in attachment, trauma, and the perinatal phase. She's the author of Parenting for Humans and Why Birth Trauma Matters. She's also an activist. She founded the Psychology Co-operative, Make Birth Better CIC. She's known for her community building work. She facilitates a community on Facebook called The Village. And she was referred to me by Amanda Ruggieri, who is a BBC journalist who was on the podcast talking about expertise and how to find good experts. And so Emma and I dive into her book, which is essentially not a parenting book, but rather a book for parents. And we talk about several big ideas, including how it seems to me that the preparation to become a parent and to excel as a parent is to dive deep into your own space and to do the personal development work. We talk about feelings being memories trapped in your system from a pre-verbal stage. That's a big idea. We talked about different power dynamics. We talked about helping. We talked about the idea that we don't necessarily train for parenthood, but that we could. We talk about confidence. So this is a really good deep dive into the individual aspect of parenting. It talks more about talks more about the mental and emotional components rather than here is a dozen things that you should do and do not. And not do? Gosh, my brain's not alive today. Uh, it So Emma and I dive deep in this one. She's wonderful. She's very eloquent. Her first answer even astounds me, and I think I pause and say, "Geez, you're a smart cookie. You are a sharp crayon in the box of life." So anyway, I'm rambling, but this is a great conversation all about parenting, and you are going to adore Dr. Emma Svanberg. All right. Dr. Emma Spanberg. I'm realizing that it's like Goldberg Svanberg connection
Oh
tonight.
yeah, nice.
Yeah.
We have the Bergs in the house.
Welcome to the podcast. And I wanted to lead with this question that you have on your Instagram bio. You describe yourself as a parenting disruptor, and I love that. And I think it's such a great phrase. And I also am so intrigued by what the heck that means and who the heck you are. So for those listening that have no idea, what if we just dive in there for a second?
And I'm so happy that you asked me this question because I've just changed my bio. So you're the first person who's asked me what it actually means. So
Okay.
I'm really, really happy to be asked. I mean, the boring bit of who I am is that I'm a clinical psychologist and I work predominantly with parents and parents to be. So I work with parents from sort of pregnancy through birth to the early years of parenthood. And over the course of my career, which is sort of 20 years of working with families in various different guises, one of the things that I've realized that I do most often is to disrupt the narratives that people come with to therapy. And then I've kind of extended that to doing more kind of activism work. I do a lot of stuff on Instagram, I write. So that's become a really big part of my work. And a lot of the things that I think about really is how do we how can we sort of disrupt this very narrow and increasingly narrow, actually, mainstream view of what parents do and who they are and how they act and how their children should act. And I was kind of thinking about this as like paradigm shifting or narrative breaking. We talk a lot about breaking cycles, but actually, I love the word disrupt. So I was like, they are going to disrupt. I want to disrupt things. And I feel like I'm kind of at this stage of my life and career where I can be a bit bolder. You know, I've kind of been around the block a few times now, so I'm able to say, no, actually, I don't want to be careful and tentative about this. I just want to knock some walls down and allow people to parent in ways that suit them and feel a bit more free and a bit more about who they are.
I love that. I'm reminded of John Lewis, this former U.S. congressman, and he used to say, like, get in good trouble. I think he said, cause good trouble.
Oh, nice.
It
Like
sounds
that.
similar to what you're saying there of those that are just listening. She's kind of got a smirk and a little twinkle in the eye when she's talking about this stuff.
And I'm waving my hands around.
Yeah, there's an animation there. And I think that comes, with 20 years of experience. You've been around the block. Maybe you've thickened your skin in places. You know what you know what you don't know. And it's like, yeah, I could dance around this, but I'd rather just say it how it is and how I feel. And let's just
Yeah.
cut the shit and get to the point. Is that fair?
Exactly, exactly. I think that's very fair. And I think that there is a lot of shit when it comes to parenting and parenting advice and the information and all of the kind of massive amount of information that there is out there for parents at the moment. So I think it's really important to have places where you can just cut through all of that and think about what really matters to you, what feels important to you.
Yeah. And I'm realizing this just for context. My partner is 37 weeks pregnant now with our first. And I have been having an experience, as you can imagine, and that's an understatement, but also realizing, like, oh, I don't really know this space very well. Like,
Mm,
I work in personal development, I'm across it, I know the players, I get it. Like, I've spent years formulating my own sort of way. And then I
mm,
started diving into the parenting space, and it's like, oh, and like I'm a former scientist. Like I'm good at information. I'm good at like
yeah.
going through the weeds. And still I found myself like very often reading contradictory
Oh,
ideas
yeah.
from therapists and doctors and scientists. And it's like, oh, this is a whole jungle out here. And so I reached out to a BBC journalist named Amanda Ruggieri, who was on the podcast talking about expertise. And she's great, and we've just vibed. And so I would periodically send her things like, do we like this person? Is this good? Like, she's been my kind of like oracle North Star. And I think at some point she got annoyed with this is me projecting, but at some point she's like, look, like Emma's good. And she listed a couple others. And I was like, okay, I'm going to just reach out and pick their brain and
Great.
see where we end up. So that's how we've sat here together. I don't know if I've told you that yet.
Yeah. No, I love that. It's great. And I really admire her work. So I'm very honored that she thought of me.
Yeah, yeah. And so I got your book, which is called Parenting for Humans: How to Parent the Child You Have as the Person You Are. And I was like, I like that title because I'm a big word dork. And admittedly, I'm only about halfway through, but I'm realizing that I haven't like been told how to parent. I haven't been given specific 10 tricks to get your baby to sleep. And I feel like it's all been about me and my shadows and who I am. And so this is a long-winded way of saying what's your what's your view of parenting and why did you write a book? What did you describe it as? Not a parenting book, but a book for parents.
Yes, exactly. So I feel like it's the book that I'd love people to read before they read any kind of parenting manual where they might get those 10 top tips to get your baby to sleep through the night. Because I think there's a lot of information out there about the things that you can do and the strategies that you can use. And the experience that I've often had is that people then say, well, I'm doing all of those things and I'm using all of the tips and they're not working and I don't know why. And usually that's because people are applying them to a sort of blank canvas. They're thinking about, well, if I just do this and I just act in this way, or I do this parenting behavior, whatever it might be, then my child will respond in the way that they're supposed to respond, and then everything's going to be golden. But of course, what that misses out is who is that information landing on? You know, the way that we are and the way that we show up as parents and as people in the world. So the things that we carry from our own childhood experiences, from the relationships that we have around us at the moment, from everything else that's going on in our lives outside of our parenting. So we're going to apply that information in very specific ways. Also, depending on the kind of context that we were parented in. So thinking about how similar or different that information is to the kind of experiences we had growing up. And then, of course, there is the actual child that we're applying it to. And there are children out there who will really readily engage with those 10 top tips and be able to sleep through the night or whatever it is that you're trying to get them to do. And there are a whole host of other children who just will not do that because that's not the strategy that's going to work for them. And I think that that's where people can get really stuck, kind of sifting through all of this information, finding something that they really hope is going to work for them. And then because they haven't really thought about or haven't been encouraged to think about how does this actually fit for me in my family and in the context that I'm in, then it doesn't feel like it works. And then the really difficult thing for people is that they then think I'm doing something wrong or there's something wrong with my child. And then everything ends up feeling kind of fraught and uncomfortable, and people end up feeling like they don't have any strategies at all. And then what we tend to do, rather than look within and think about, well, how can I apply this in a way that works for me, is that we then just go to a different 10 top tips and then we try that one. And at no point are we really thinking about how can I offer this in a way that is grounded, that fits with me and my values and my capacities, and in a way that's going to work for my child as well.
That was like so eloquent.
Thanks.
Yeah, holy moly. Uh, okay. And so then for me as an expectant soon to be parent who's attempting to navigate all of this stuff, and for someone like you who has 20 years of experience working with parents and dealing with this stuff, are there very specific obstacles coming down my road that you could? I'm just selfishly using this for my own
You want
personal,
you want some 10 top tips?
of like, not the 10 razzle dazzle tips, but like, hey, I just wrote this book and I'm, a renowned expert at some of this stuff. So you and those listening should be aware of these things. That makes sense?
Total sense. Yeah, I'm pulling your leg. Yeah, I think
I'm fragile right now, Emma. Come on.
I know. Shouldn't do this to an expectant father. I'm sorry. I think that the key of one key obstacle is what we've spoken about, right? That kind of sense of filling the need to know with information. So as exactly as you said, you're in a whole new space. So parenting is a whole culture, and there is now a huge industrial complex around parenting and parenting advice. So you're stepping into this whole new culture, this new community, this new place where people are going to encourage you to buy loads of stuff as well. So there is this feeling of I need to have all of this stuff and I need to know all of this information. I need to know all of it right now. And because that phase of our lives, that transition that we're coming into in becoming parents, is one where inevitably we feel out of control, inevitably we feel really uncertain, inevitably we feel fragile. It's a really easy solution and one that we tend to turn to, right, to fill that gap with stuff, right, with information, with toys or the perfect bassinet or whatever it might be that makes you feel like for that one moment, okay, at least I've got a handle on this. Right, this is why we spend so much time decorating the nursery or buying the best buggy or researching nappies, but we don't spend that time going, but how do I feel about the fact that I am about to become responsible for a whole new human being? And this is a relationship that I am going to be in for the whole of the rest of my life. That's incomprehensibly massive. So of course we then go, well, actually, I'm just going to focus on the buggy because that feels okay. So I'd say my one thing is actually being able to give yourself the space to feel uncertain that this is a transition for the next couple of years. You're in this liminal space where you're getting to know who you are as a parent, who this little person is who comes into your life, who your partner is as a parent as well. You become a family. That's huge. And just allowing the space for that to sort of flow through so that you can go through and honor that transition together without that need for certainty, because things change so rapidly through pregnancy, through birth, in the postnatal phase, but even, up until they're adults, things are changing all the time. And of course, you're changing too. So being able to just be okay with uncertainty, actually, I can ride this wave. Like none of this is going to land. I'm not going to feel anchored for a while. So how am I just going to learn to surf this so that I can feel
Mm.
comfortable with this not knowing? So I think that's one of the key things, is really just getting used to that feeling of not knowing. And then I think for me, there's something, I mean, you asked about obstacles. I mean, maybe a kind of slightly smaller point is that you get so much advice from everyone, from every direction. I mean, I say this having literally just given you advice, but
And written a book.
it comes from every direction. And being able to also find a way to feel certain in being able to kind of keep that sense of uncertainty, I guess, or keep that like allowing yourself to not know, so that you're able to say to all of that often very well-meaning advice like, thank you, but I've got this, I'm going to find my own path.
Mm.
I think as well, I mean, some of the things that I notice trip people up kind of time and time again is that we get into these really entrenched patterns that are from our own experiences. So these might be patterns that we get into in our parenting, with ourselves, with our child, but particularly with our partner when we're parenting with another person. That this is where I think traditional gender roles, gender expectations, all of the kind of systemic stuff that comes alongside, who does what in a family, who has what role. These are things that I think people often don't talk about in detail before a baby comes along, because they're thinking more about the practical considerations, or what we're going to do for birth, what we're going to do in those early weeks.
Mm.
But actually being able to talk about what are your hopes and dreams for what it's going to be like to be a father? Where do you get those ideas from? For your partner, what are their expectations about being a parent? Where do those ideas come from? And being able to think it together about how are we going to manage when inevitably some of those things clash. When actually this expectation that I just carry with me, that I've never even brought into my consciousness, all of a sudden clashes with something that feels really important to you. So almost being able to lay that groundwork even before the baby comes, to know that there's going to be disharmony, there's going to be discord, but that this is part of family life, like being able to kind of chew these things over together so that you can find a way to collaborate in your parenting and be a parenting team, which can feel really tricky for people.
Yeah, and I think you've touched on something that I find helpful, which is some of my self-talk is to reframe it as, oh no, it's supposed to feel like this. You're doing it right. Like it's supposed to feel scary. It's supposed to feel uncertainty. You're not supposed to know how
You're
to
not
do this.
supposed to know. How are you supposed to know? It's
This
it's
is
a new
it.
skill, a new
Yeah.
skill, new relationship. I mean, a whole new set of skills, and they change constantly, especially in those kind of early days. You sort of just about get the hang of changing a nappy, and then something else shifts. So you're always in this learning process, and your baby is the person who is going to teach you about those things.
Mm. Yeah, I've had a couple friends say similar things to the effect of, "Oh, you just when you get the hang of it, it stops or it changes."
Yeah,
So be prepared for that. And I'm also remembering that, like, as adults, or at least for me personally, it's quite rare that I feel like a beginner at something,
Mm,
right? Like, I've got my hobbies. I know how to ride the bike. I know how to be in a relationship. And this feels like learning to ride the bike again. It's like, oh, I don't even know what to call that part of the bike, or I don't even know where to buy bikes, or I don't even know
yeah.
who to teach me to ride a bike. And it's this really old, uh, from the past experience that's now alive in my body again. It's like,
Mm,
oh, I think you said adrift or ungrounded. And
yeah.
it sounds like what you're saying is the work, or the responsibility, perhaps, or the privilege is maybe a nicer way to frame that, is
Mm.
to learn to navigate that uncertainty with a bit of grace and communication and compassion, rather than attempting to seek external ways to fill that little hole with the articles and the bassinet, etc.
Yes, and I think, the impression that we are given is, well, I'm supposed to know how to ride this bike already because parenting is seen as this natural instinct that we have, particularly for women, right? There is this kind of fallacy of maternal instinct that still exists. And so we come into it expecting that we're supposed to ride the bike and we're supposed to know what we're doing. And actually, it turns out that the bike is more complicated than any bike we've ever seen ever before. And there's no instruction manual. And actually, maybe the way that you were taught to ride a bike is completely wrong for riding this bike. So there's unlearning as well as learning that has to go on. Also, when you're pretty sleep deprived and sort of getting to know this whole new identity of yours. So it's a big task, but it's one that if we can, I think exactly as you say, come to it with grace, with compassion for ourselves, with an expectation that we're going to fall off that bike and get a bit bruised sometimes, but it's okay to do that because we're learning, then we'll be able to navigate it with much more ease.
Yeah, and something I read on your Instagram feed was just this question, which is, why don't we train for parenthood? And I read that post and it just felt so true to me, of like, so obvious. Even to like drive a car, you have to go to a class and then you need to pass a test. And that's just to drive this giant death machine. But here it's like, here is your human being. Uh, Good luck. Take care. Bye bye. So why don't we train for parenthood, and sort of what does training look like to you?
Well, I think we did. And I think other cultures do. I think this is something that's quite unique to Europe and the US in the way that there is this expectation in these kind of individualistic cultures that we are parenting in isolation. So there is both this kind of expectation that we will know it because it's a kind of innate or inherent thing that just happens through generations. But at the same time, there is no support around it, very, very little support in
Mm.
terms of actually not just educating people, but then holding them in community so that when they are falling off the bike, there's somebody there to help them get back on again and perhaps show them a different way. In other cultures and historically, we did have lots of people around us who could train us in different skills as well as just holding us emotionally, bringing us food, all of those practical things that become so much easier when you have other people around. In the
Mm.
model that we kind of live in nowadays, we live in a model where we do train for things, right? That we're learning skills. I think that part of it, in terms, I mean, we can offer things like antenatal classes that are often very focused on getting through pregnancy and birth and maybe the first couple of months. But where parents often feel like they really need support is once they get kind of over that bit and the baby's actually still there. And, they kind of haven't really thought about, well, what happens when they get to like a year old? Certainly what happens when they get to seven. Like nobody talks about 7 year olds and what's it like to parent a 7 year old. People are starting to talk a little bit more about what it's like to parent a teenager. But this being a whole lifelong relationship that is always going to be changing and that we're always going to need new skills for. So in that sense, I think that what ends up happening is people do fill that gap with their own learning, with their own information. But as we started with, there's so much of it out there, and it's really hard to sift through all of that and know who you can trust, but also who who kind of aligns with your values, who is talking about the context that you're living in. And I think one of the things that's really complicated for a lot of people in this generation of parents is that they know that they don't necessarily want to parent in the way that their parents parented, because they're very aware of some of the baggage that they've been left with, but they don't really know what to replace it with. And that can feel like quite a destabilizing place to be, to kind of know that you want to let go of one anchor, but you don't really have something that feels kind of solid to hold on to. And I think that what often happens is that one person in a partnership might then go off and try and do lots of training and lots of information gathering. And if their partner's kind of not alongside, that in itself can lead to resentment. That's something that I often see, where one person has done loads of educating of themselves, and then their partner's still of the kind of mindset of, oh, it's fine, it's completely natural, I'll just kind of pick it up as we go. And that in itself is a sort of conflict before the baby even arrives.
Hmm.
I think in some ways that we could train, it would be great to be able to have well respected and trusted information. But we also know that it's really hard to apply that to everybody, because everybody is in a different context and all babies are different. I think in some ways our training is, just being able to learn about how to be in relation with other people, our baby being one of those other people. But it's something that we really struggle with in our individualistic cultures, to just be heart led and be able to tune in to somebody on that emotional level. Babies are just nervous systems, right? They are these little balls of emotion, and that can feel very overwhelming. But if we're able to tune into what their nervous system is telling our nervous system, then we can have this really beautiful dance and connection between us.
Yeah, that's really well said. I've never heard it described so succinctly as babies or nervous systems. It's like, oh, yes, of course, that makes sense. And on the training piece, I think about, training with sports or training with skills. And typically the way that you would do that is you would find somebody who has been where you are, who has advanced to a level of knowledge and experience that you aspire to or that you don't currently have. And you just kind of like hang around them and listen to them, but also watch them do it, right?
Mm,
Like, watch how I cut this wood, watch how I paint this mountain, watch how I throw this ball. And I think for many people, and maybe I'm just speaking for myself, but we know sort of what we don't want to do, as you described, based
mm,
on our own experience with our own parents and the way society and culture are traversing the now, which is a separate podcast. But we don't necessarily have visceral firsthand experience with good parents or even being around small children or
yes,
newborns or babies. And it's like, oh, like we just lack that village component entirely. And we're kind of
yeah,
off on our own trying to figure it out.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
exactly this.
yeah, and
And they feel
I
so
think about,
fragile, right? When they're so tiny, they feel so fragile. And actually, what we need
yeah,
at that point as parents is for somebody to come and look after us, so that, it's ideally we have a community of people who are all centered around this new life. But often what ends up happening is exactly as you said, you sort of handed a baby and then you go home and you're like, oh my God, what the hell do I do with this thing? And they are just little creatures at the beginning. And it can feel, I mean, it's incredibly anxiety provoking experience if you don't have somebody more experienced with you to say that this is okay, this is normal. That weird noise that they just made, like that's a completely normal noise. And
hmm,
I think, the other side of it is that we do have a very normal anxiety. So we do, I mean, it's worth you knowing this, in the first kind of weeks and months after a baby is born, our anxiety really spikes and we become quite hypervigilant to the point where, we would meet thresholds on trauma criteria because we're so hypervigilant. And that is a survival response, right? Everything in our being is primed to look out for danger for this baby. And if we don't know that, sometimes we can start to second guess ourselves, like, why am I so anxious? Why is it that I'm feeling so jittery? Why can't I sleep? But actually that is your body doing exactly what it's supposed to do, to keep this baby safe from predators and listen out for every little snuffle and make sure that they're okay.
yeah, that's wild. So I think what I'm hearing is that what is happening in your system, in your body, is the equivalent of like getting in a car crash or having some traumatic incident occur. That it's, does that make
Well,
sense?
yeah, essentially, it's like an anxiety, so not without the sort of intrusive thoughts that might come with trauma. Although people do often have intrusive thoughts as well in that kind of postnatal phase, there is
Mm,
this kind of sense of, I'm going to say it's equivalent to having been through a really shocking incident or having witnessed something shocking, so that you
mm,
are then you're looking out for danger on every corner.
right.
And we become all of the things that change in our brain is that we become like really tuned into social cues because of obviously we're looking out to see who is safe, who is threatening, so that we can keep our baby safe.
Yeah. I just interviewed a midwife with decades of experience, and she talked about how she views that role as literally her knitting in the corner and
Yeah,
just being there, and then occasionally making eye contact with the mother who's having some kind of experience that feels anxious or scary, and they just lock eyes, and she just like gives the little nod that's like that reassurance, right? Like, you're
yeah,
doing it right, this is normal, keep going. And it seems analogous to what you're describing here, which is that like we lack that sort of elder in the corner or the
yeah,
village that's just given us the, yep,
yeah.
that's
You're
right,
doing great. You're doing
you're
great.
great.
Yeah,
And so
yeah,
we persist in that anxious stew of uncertainty and self-judgment and comparison and guilt and
yeah.
exhaustion. So how does one avoid that?
Well, I think we have to
Hypothetically, if one was having a child
hypothetically
soon.
asking for a friend.
Yeah.
Um, I think we create our own village. I think that's what we often do very naturally, and to be able to reject that story that we're supposed to be doing this by ourselves, that we're supposed to be coping on our own, and that if we don't feel like we're coping perfectly, then we're doing something wrong. Like that might be the sort of prevailing narrative that I often hear.
Mhm.
So to counteract that with actually, I'm going to talk about the things that I'm finding difficult, and I'm going to seek reassurance from people, and I'm going to do that as often as I need to. And that's not me being anxious, it's me learning and it's me seeking support from people. And I mean, it helps to find the right people because, of course, sometimes we can seek reassurance and we get advice that makes us feel worse or it just doesn't gel with what we're looking for. But there are so many communities, online communities, as well as real life communities. And what we know is that you only need a couple of people to be able to just give you that nod or give you the sort of hypothetical nod or give you the text,
Mm,
the reassurance that, yeah, you're doing okay. And often
yeah.
that is enough to just get us back on our own track. We don't necessarily need someone to come and hold our hand or to, help. I mean, it really helps to have someone sometimes to come and hold the baby. But really, what we need is just somebody to kind of metaphorically wrap their arms around us and offer us some parenting and say, actually, I'm here. You're doing fine. Keep on going.
Yeah, that's helpful. And that echoes some of the comments that we've had from friends who are already parents who have said things like, freeze more food ahead of time than you think you need, or get a meal train where your community supports and provides, and ask friends to come do the laundry and leave food on the porch and then just go away. And that's been eye opening to me in the sense that, like, I knew that I would need support and that support is good, but to hear it reiterated time and time again, it's like, oh, this is actually a core part of what this experience needs to be, um, or perhaps should be in an ideal world, that the
Hmm.
parents are cared for in a community, that they're being looked after, that they're being held, etc.
Yeah,
Does that make sense? Am I on the right track there?
absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it's also kind of whatever support actually feels supportive for you. So for some people, actually, they really want somebody to be there with them, have that physical presence of somebody else in the home. For somebody else, that might feel like their worst nightmare, and they really just want to be on their own or in their own
Mm,
little bubble, kind of getting to know the baby. So being able to also ask for the help that you need, the help that will feel helpful rather than the help that somebody else thinks will be helpful, which can be quite tricky.
Right. And this is directly, um, I was going to say correlated, but as an individual who is doing personal development work, it's the same skill sets, right? It's
Yeah,
like practicing self awareness, identifying what you need, using your voice, having healthy communication, emotional intelligence. It's all this stuff. It's just I'm hopeful that it's all this stuff, and it's just being repackaged and put in this new
yeah.
environment, and perhaps with the volume cranked up to full. It's like, oh, you thought you were good at this before. Like, no, 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 no.
Well, you mentioned shadows, right? Which is what the first half of my book is all about. And what cranks it up is that with being faced with this little creature brings up so much about our own history, our own experiences, all of those patterns that even if we've done a load of self development work, there might still be parts of us that we've kind of avoided or we've pushed away or we just kind of haven't quite wanted to look in that Pandora's box. And somehow they all come up when you become a new parent. And then they continue to come up as your child grows, because when your child is at different ages and stages and different parts of their development, of course, they are a mirror to you at that same age. So you
Mm.
can find that you're flooded with memories of things that you'd forgotten. You might hear, kind of phrases from your own childhood that kind of feel like they've been long buried. And it's literally just that, having that experience creates a new pathway to your memory. So it kind of opens up some of those old pathways that have been quite heavily locked down for quite a long time. And if you can allow yourself to go there, and it can feel really challenging to go there when you want to be in this space of being able to be fully present for your baby and for your partner. So in some ways, it can feel quite tricky to then take yourself away to have that space, or not necessarily take yourself physically away, but to give yourself the sort of presence and the space to be able to kind of think about what's coming up for you, because you don't have the time, you don't have the headspace to be able to really kind of spend the time thinking about what this is meaning to you. So you also get very quick at doing self-development work, right? You have to do it in a much more perfunctory way where emotions come up quite quickly and then you find ways to be able to process them. And then that's a whole new skill in itself.
Mm. Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up because I had a question about this, or actually wanted to have you expand on this because I was reading part of your book and I was sitting next to my partner and I was like, whoa. And I read part of it out loud, but it was around the idea that feelings are memories. And that was the way that I interpreted it, and it might even be the way that you bluntly stated it. But I'd never actually, for whatever reason, put that together in my brain, even though it's so intuitive and reasonable. Of like, oh, when I'm holding my baby and it's invoking or evoking this sensation in my system that is a feeling, that also might be an old pre-verbal memory that I had when I was a tiny human. Can
Mm-hmm.
you speak to that or expand on
Yeah.
that?
So I think what you're referring to is a part of the book where I talk about how some of those really big feelings are very powerful and kind of all-encompassing feelings that can come up for some people, not everybody, but for some people in the sort of parenting of a baby, and that can be really resonant with some things that happened to us in terms of the feelings that we had when we were of a similar age that are unprocessed, right? They're our most raw emotions because they're
Mm.
pre-verbal. We know from Donald Winnicott's research kind of back in the 1950s and 60s, some of the things that he spoke about were this kind of absolute terror that babies can feel. It's like a fear of annihilation because everything is so extreme for a child, for a baby, before they're able to understand what's happening to them and what's happening in their bodies and what's happening in the world around them. So it can bring up in us these very raw, unprocessed feelings that are like sort of emotional memories that can kind of come up. So we're often it can be a very complicated dynamic that's happening. For example, when your baby's crying and you can't soothe it. So that can feel like a really challenging experience for a for a new parent, because baby crying inconsolably is a heart-rending experience. So it's pulling on every part of your being already, because you want to do anything that you can to be able to soothe this baby. Simultaneously, you might also have these echoes of feelings that you might have experienced from a similar age. And it feels a bit woo woo, right, to think about your kind of baby self, the kind of baby that comes up in you. But we do talk a lot about inner child work and these kind of childhood memories and childhood experiences that we carry. Of course, we also carry them from our babyhood, they're just much more physiological. So we can sometimes feel these really overwhelming feelings in response to our baby's overwhelming feelings. And if we're able to separate out what belongs to us and what belongs to them, then it leads to, a calmer experience for us, but it also means that we're more able to see what our baby needs. So, like, an example of that might be if you, as a baby, let's say, for example, were often left to cry on your own, something that happened a lot to babies in my generation, certainly babies in our parents' generation. So there might have been for you as a baby, as a young toddler, a kind of feeling of abandonment, right? Like, I'll cry and I'm gonna feel like nobody's coming to help me. So your baby doesn't have that experience, but your baby crying might remind you of that feeling of abandonment that was brought up in you at a similar age. And so you might then project onto your baby, oh, you're feeling abandoned by me. And you're then soothing it, you're soothing this feeling of abandonment in your baby, but actually maybe your baby's just cold and you can't really hear that because you're so full of your own fear of them feeling abandoned by you.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so beautiful, but also it feels complex.
Yeah,
Like, oh, this isn't mine. And I suppose one way I've thought about this and tried to work through some of this is when I realize or recognize that my reaction is disproportionate to what's happening, right? And so it might be a baby crying, but in my system, it feels like I'm in a war zone or something,
yeah,
or that I lash out angrily about
exactly this.
the kitchen towel on the counter when it's just a kitchen towel. It's like, oh, hang on, like that's interesting that there's a big mismatch there.
Yeah.
Is that one example of how to do that, or do you have other suggestions?
No, I think that's a brilliant suggestion. So you're looking out for your sort of fight, flight response. You might also shut down, right? That's a very common response. So it might be the kind of opposite response where you notice that you're not really having much of an emotional reaction at all, that actually you feel quite distant from your baby crying, because that's another coping strategy. So if we're thinking about those kind of primary stress responses of fight, flight, freeze, or flop, then anything like that that comes up for you where you're feeling that the response is just even slightly mismatched, and it's maybe stopping you from being able to figure out what your baby is communicating to you.
Mm. I have a completely random question. Is it possible to turn on a light where you
I've
are?
just realized I'm really dark. Yeah.
I I've observed you just getting
Yeah, the lights just, sorry, are you, but I'll do this and then
darker and darker and darker. I was
there
like,
we
I've
go.
got to
Yeah, I
ask.
know. I was looking at your face and then I just saw myself and was like, oh my God, I'm literally sitting in a
Yeah,
shadow.
yeah. Well, okay, so that's super helpful though. I also have a note to myself to read the quote at the beginning of your book, and here we go. Some people seem to think of a child as clay in the hands of a potter. They start molding the infant and feeling responsible for the result. This is quite wrong. Donald Winnicott. So, why is that the quote at the beginning of your book? Why is it wrong? What do we do with the clay instead?
So one of the original titles for the book was Hold Them, Don't Mold Them, which is kind of based on Winnicott's quote. And I think that we still have this idea that children are ours to shape, that they are these little beings that if we parent in the right way, then we can shape the people that they're going to become. And that's a fallacy. They are the people that they are, and we can support them in their own growth and development, but we can't change who they are as people. And the more that we understand that, we're there to kind of support them on their journey, offer them a kind of helping hand if they ask for it, but essentially, they're walking their own path, then the easier things become for us. The less expectation there is on us as their parents, as well as on the people that they are and the people that we kind of expect them to be. And also the more joy there is in our connection, because we're able to meet them as the people that they are.
That's beautiful. And just personally in my own life, I've had this moment years ago. So I was working as a scientist on the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, and I grew up in Los Angeles with the blue collar family that owned a tire shop for 50 years. And I was very different, and I always felt like the black sheep, and that created all kinds of stories and things that I probably should have talked to you 20 years ago about. But then I got to this place where it was like, oh, what a wonderful job my parents did to allow me to become this completely different, unique, living a life that they would never have contemplated person. And that, like, that's a really good thing, I think, rather than if I had just stayed in that family mold and worked at the tire shop and like had the same beliefs and values as them. Like, how do you distinguish between the molding and the allowing to unfurl?
I mean, I guess it's a practice, right? It's what we do throughout our parenting journey, is how do we practice allowing these people to be themselves and for us to be there, yeah, to support them, but not to try and shape them in any way. And I mean, I think one of the things that you often realize when you have your own child is that they just come out like as they are, and they're like that. You'll speak to parents who have kind of older, middle-aged, grown-up children, and they'll say, there is this spark in them that has been there since the day they were born. I recognize
Mm,
this essence of them that has always been there. And I think that we can put that spark out very quickly as parents when we kind of pass on our expectations that our children aren't able to meet, or our criticism, our perfectionism, our anxiety, all of these things that can kind of get in the way of that sort of pure connection. And being able to allow them to sort of hold on to that spark of who they are can be one of the most gratifying parts of being a parent. And it also
mm,
allows us to access the spark that we might have lost, right? The bits of us that
mm.
were really exciting and inspired by things and curious and weren't cynical and didn't find things boring, all of those things that children just hold so naturally. So the more that we can kind of allow them to keep their spark going, we also get that kind of added bonus of a gift of re-engaging or reigniting our own spark.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard it described amongst many parents who have had the second child. And then they have the first child, and it's like, I know how to do this. I've sorted it out. I'm good. And then the second child is just like, from moment one, just a different
Completely different.
species entirely. Like, doesn't eat the same, doesn't sleep the same, doesn't cry the same. It's like the personality is just dropped in and downloaded from the go.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like perhaps another example of that. And I think what
Yeah.
you're alluding to with some of that might be this like generational trauma component or this ancestral momentum where it's very common in personal development of like, I'm going to be the one that pivots the
Right.
lineage. I'm
Yeah.
going to heal it for my kids so that they don't have to continue that trajectory. And so it seems like what you're saying is there is some amount of holding space or the container so that inside of that the little creature can be and dazzle and have that spark to be
Yeah.
whatever it needs to be.
Yeah. And grow in whatever direction they want to grow in. I'm
Right.
going to say, though, I think that there is this. it's quite a new pressure to be a cycle breaker. Like, I think this is something that has really gained momentum over the last few years, where not only do you have to be a good parent, but you also have to break all of your
Heal the
ancestral
entire lineage,
lineage, heal,
right?
yeah, heal it all. And you're going to do it really quickly, right, before your kid is 3. And I think that that adds a huge amount of pressure to parents, this idea that we have to break every cycle. And when we're in these periods of high stress that we can be in when we're parents, inevitably, things will pop out of our mouths, very automatic reactions when we're in those kind of fight or flighty places. All of a sudden something will just pop out of our mouth that our mum said, or that our dad said, or that our grandparents said, that we swore down that we would never, ever say to our own child. And then we have this choice. So either we can berate ourselves for not being a good enough cycle breaker, or we can wonder what was just touched in us. Why was it that meant that my dad just came out of my mouth, or my mum just came out of my mouth? What is going on for me that meant that very automatic flare just came up in me? And I don't think we're going to break cycles in our generation, but we can kind of put them on a slightly different path, right? We can allow our children to do things a little bit differently. We can bend the cycle a little bit, right? Rather than feel like we have to break it completely. And as part of
Mm.
that process, often, as you've talked about, when we're thinking about our kind of heritage, of the heritage of our relationships that can come up for us when we become parents, we also do have, not for everybody, and certainly not for people who've been through abusive situations, but we can have a newfound compassion for our parents and our caregivers in understanding perhaps the context in which they were parenting and the choices that they had to make and the reasons why maybe they made those choices. So I think that that's another gift that can come for some people during this kind of journey and wondering about their own parenting and the roots of their own parenting, is having a capacity for a new kind of relationship with your own parents and caregivers, where suddenly you're not the child anymore, right? You're now a parent too. So you become in relationship with them as a fellow parent, as an adult, and you're coming to them in quite a different context.
Yeah, I love that. I think also remembering some additional context, such as, like, it's easy to say, why didn't you model healthy anger to me? And we forget that, oh, that was 30, 40, 60 years ago when we didn't have therapists literally in our pocket telling us how
Yeah,
to do all of this. Like, oh,
yeah.
we didn't even have psychology back then. It wasn't as regarded. It wasn't a thing. And
It
so
was very
recognizing that,
exclusive. They're very exclusive and excluding in those days. And
yeah.
anger was not seen as unhealthy. That there are certain
Mm.
aspects of our emotional intelligence that have really shifted in a generation. So that context is so different for us, and our children will turn around in 20 years and say, "Why didn't you model whatever their thing is going to be?"
100%. And imagine, like, that parenting generation would have said to their parents, like, how could you have let us in the coal mines, or like, why did you pollute the rivers with your chemicals? And it was like, that's
Yeah,
just how it was. We did our best. And then it
we
just
did our
goes on and
best,
on,
right? I
right?
mean, isn't that a motto? Like, they did their best, we're doing our
Yeah.
best.
Yeah, I think that's already something I'm recognizing of, like, oh, this is very hard. And there's a lot of uncertainty, and there's still, 2024, there's a lot of information, but there's almost an overwhelming amount of information and options, and, like, oh, they did their best and we're all doing our best, and they loved us in the best way that they could, and
Yeah,
that's all we can do.
yeah, that's it.
Okay. Emma, is there anything that I haven't asked you yet that you're like, oh man, I wanted to talk about this, or you
No,
knucklehead, come
I
on?
don't. No, not at all. I've really enjoyed our conversation. I think the one kind of point, I'm sure I've made it already, is that you will look at your baby and they have so much information that they come with, and the more that you're able to connect with them, you talked about doing our best, and when being able to really immerse yourself, and actually maybe that's something that, I mean, yeah, not that, not something that I'd love to be able to say to you and any other kind of new parents or parents to be who are listening is that we can often feel like we really need to rush out of that newborn baby bubble. And sometimes we have to rush out of it because we have work or we have other commitments. But there is
Mm.
this amazing period of time when you have a newborn baby where everything changes, like time changes, your identity changes, you sort of work in cycles, day and night kind of stop meaning the same thing. And if you can stay there for as long as you can, it's a really precious place to be. So I really hope that
Mm.
you get to enjoy that bubble for a little while.
Yeah. The alternate reality dimension portal
Yeah,
that's happening.
yeah,
Thank you for the
it's
reminder.
magical, magical time.
So Emma, I know you got a website, an Instagram, a book. Is there anything else that we should highlight for people to go and get more in this? Oh, also that you hate camping. I was
Oh
dismayed.
yeah, I really did
We did,
not. I did not enjoy that experience.
yeah, we didn't touch on that, but I was laughing when I read it because I led a group camping trip like 3 weeks ago. Uh,
I'm really
and I was
happy
like,
for you that you enjoyed that. I accept it's my self-development is that I accept it's not for me.
yeah, it's not for me. So you won't be camping anytime soon, but anything coming up? Any projects or events or anything? Are you just kind of cruising along now that the
I'm
book's
just
out? And
yeah, cruising along. Yeah, cruising along. I think if I also write a blog, so I've started to write much more about, kind of more of my personal and professional interplay. So if people want to read that, it's on Substack. It's called Unnormal. But yeah, I'd love
oh,
for people to chat. I mean, it's one of the reasons that I'm on social media is I really love to talk to people from all over the world. So if people want to have a chat, then please do feel free to reach out to me.
yeah, okay. And I'll put links to all that in the show notes to those listening, including the book, the Substack, the Instagram, and thank you.
Thank
This has been
you.
great. I
It's been such a
appreciate your
pleasure.
time.
It's been
Yeah,
such a
this has been really
pleasure.
fun.
Yeah, and you must let
And
me know how you are in 6 months.
yeah, in 6 months you might get an email that's very different than the ones you've gotten previously from me. Like Emma, help, SOS. Can we? Or it'll actually probably be, hey, do you want to come back on the podcast for a minute? I have some questions hypothetically to ask you.
Yeah,
But
I look forward to that. I look forward to it.
yeah, no, I appreciate your work. I appreciate the way you're approaching it too. It feels true and it feels resonant to me, and I imagine many others. And so, thank you for the work you're doing and meeting that sort of tip of the spear that we can bend the cycle together. That's
Yeah,
great.
for sure. Thanks. Thanks, Jeremy. Been lovely to meet you.
Okay, that was Dr. Emma Spanberg. As mentioned in the show notes, I've included a link to her book, Parenting for Humans, and I've included links to the blog, the Substack, as well as the Instagram account. I encourage you to check this stuff out. She is a wealth of information. She has been doing this for 20 years. Check it out. You might learn something, might make your life a little bit easier, might make your life a little bit brighter. So, with that said, thank you for being here. Thanks for listening. Thanks for sharing this with any and all people that you think would benefit from it. It's how we build a more compassionate collective together, trying to make kindness cool. And I appreciate you being here. Got any tips? Got any comments? Got any thoughts? Please do let me know. You know where to find me. I am at Long Distance Love Bombs everywhere on the internet, including Instagram and Facebook. And thanks for being you. I look forward to talking to you soon.